What up, YouTube? Here with a post-fight video of the Sebastian Fundora versus Tszyu fight. Now, before I give y'all the summary of what happened in the fight, I'm going to tell y'all the results first. Sebastian Fundora was able to pull off the upset and become the new unified WBC and WBO super welterweight champion, winning this fight via split decision. I personally had the fight scored 116 to 113 in favor of Sebastian Fundora. It would have been 115 to 113, but I had the fifth round scored a draw, 10 points each for both fighters, hence why the scorecards look like that on my scorecards, that is. And one of the judges had this fight scored in favor of Tszyu, surprisingly, because I thought Sebastian Fundora, after what happened in the second round, won the fight decisively. Now, to sum up what happened in the fight, I'm not going to say it was controversial because Sebastian Fundora won this fight fair and square. But if what happened in the second round didn't take place, I can confidently say that it could have turned out to be different, because from the start of the fight, Tszyu came out to fight, and he showed that he is a fast starter, and he showed signs of success from the sound of that bell. He closed the gap and was able to control the distance of the fight from the first round and on. He was successful at accurately landing some heavy shots at Sebastian Fundora, and you could tell by the thud of the sound and the reaction of Fundora that it was effective. And how the second round ended, you could tell that Sebastian Fundora had a hard time from the first two rounds at catching the rhythm and the pace of Tszyu. And Tszyu's efficient power shots was taking its toll on Sebastian Fundora from the get-go. And if y'all saw the fight last night, after the second round, that's when the momentum of the fight was shift. And I say it was shift because Sebastian Fundora accidentally hit the top of Tszyu's forehead with his left elbow. Granted, Tszyu leaned forward while trying to duck a possible shot from Sebastian Fundora, and Tszyu, because he would have the disadvantage when it came to arm length, he wanted the fight to be fought at a closer range than from the outside, where Sebastian Fundora would like to have the fight competed at. And with Tszyu dictating the first two rounds, Sebastian Fundora didn't get the fight to be fought at the distance that he wanted the fight to be fought at. Hence why, because of that no distance and that close gap range that they were fighting at, when Tszyu leaned and ducked under, he ran into the left elbow of Sebastian Fundora. Y'all could go check out the replay, and you see that Sebastian Fundora was aware and was on high alert at a possible looping overhand right hand coming from Tszyu that was landing successfully throughout the first two rounds. And throughout the whole entirety of the fight, Tszyu, his best punches that was most effective were the left hook and the overhand right hand and the right hook as well. And they still had the same heavy thud effects as it did in the first two rounds throughout the whole entirety of the fight. And because Sebastian Fundora was on high alert of that arsenal of Tszyu, he lifted up his elbow in order for him to have his guard up for him to block the shot that was possibly coming from Tszyu. That's why it was on accident. And then immediately when that elbow had caused that cut on the forehead of Tszyu, Tszyu knew that the blood was dripping profusely after that elbow had landed. And on the other hand, Sebastian Fundora, his nose and his mouth was bleeding profusely. So it was like a reflection on one hand to another, with Tszyu having that big cut on his forehead, and his cut man in his corner couldn't stop that blood from dripping throughout the entirety of the fight. Tszyu was looking like a crimson mess from the second round all the way to the end of the fight, as it was for Sebastian Fundora. His cut man in his corner couldn't stop the blood from coming out and dripping from his nose and from on out his mouth. And unlike Tszyu's cut, the blood that was coming out of Sebastian Fundora, it was caused by punches from Tszyu. And that flow of blood is almost as effective, if not just as effective, as the cut that was on Tszyu that was affecting him and his ability and how he performed in that fight, because it affects the breathing for the fighter that is bleeding out the nose and the mouth. And from what was displayed in that fight last night, both fighters did a good job at maintaining their composure throughout the whole fight. They acted like veterans. They acted like they was well experienced. They fought at a high level, and that's because they didn't let what was to affect them as much as it would most fighters. And after that second round, from the third round and on, Sebastian Fundora took advantage of Tszyu's momentum slowing down due to the fact that the blood was dripping out of his forehead profusely, unstoppably. And it didn't really affect Tszyu's vision as much as the viewers were expecting it to, because Tszyu kept calm, but you could tell that it was affecting them as expected, because Tszyu's offense was slowed down from the first two rounds and what he was displaying when he didn't have that cut on his forehead. He was more cautious, and he was kept at bay and couldn't close that gap as effectively as he was able to do in the beginning rounds before that cut. Granted, Tszyu was still effective at clearing what was attempting to affect his vision, with the blood that was trickling down from his forehead onto his pupils and his eyes that was dripping, and the blood was covering his eyes. And because it kept flowing out of his forehead and dripping down from his forehead onto the rest of his face, Tszyu, for him to clear, in order for him to clear the blood out of his sight, he would have to smear his gloves to move the blood that was dripping onto his eyes out the way for him to see clearly. And that was what was affecting his offense and the rhythm of Tszyu to get at Sebastian Fundora and close that gap and press Sebastian Fundora back, and pressing him by landing effective shots accurately as he was prior to that moment in the end of the second round. And Sebastian Fundora, shout out to him, because he did the smart thing. He stuck to the basic fundamentals, and that was him sticking out that jab and him using his height and reach advantage, and the fact that Tszyu's cut was affecting his momentum and his regular style of fighting, Sebastian Fundora, because of that factor, that was an opportunity for him to take advantage of, as he should. He took full advantage of that, and he didn't try and do nothing fancy. Sebastian Fundora threw out the 1-2, and he fought his regular fight. And Sebastian Fundora's style is him working off of volume and working at a high-paced work rate, and that's throwing a lot of shots, and that's him overwhelming his opponents by throwing a lot of shots. It may not be that effective, it may not be that accurate, it may not even be that powerful, but that work rate keeps his opponents at bay. And Sebastian Fundora's got this awkward style of fighting at where he doesn't tend to take that much advantage of his reach and height advantage, because he is very awkwardly tall and lengthy, standing at 6'6" for a fighter that fights at super welterweight. And he doesn't use it that effectively when it comes to his reach and height advantage, because he tends to throw without that much thought and intention to it, and that leaves him to be able to be open to get countered, as you saw in that fight versus Brian Mendoza, where he was getting caught with flush counter shots that eventually led Sebastian Fundora to get knocked out in his first professional defeat. And then he had a decent to good performance in his bounce back fight from his first defeat versus Sebastian Fundora. And then in this fight, I'm not trying to sound like a hater. I'm not trying to take no credits away from Sebastian Fundora, nor am I making excuses for the defeat of Tszyu, because all that's going to sound like is coulda, shoulda, woulda. And Sebastian Fundora, he deserved this win because he fought the better fight, and what had happened in the second round wasn't his fault. And I was surprised that the physicians ringside let this fight continue, because there were lesser serious cuts that was caused by an accident that led for the doctors ringside to stop the fight before, in countless fights with scenarios like this fight with Fundora and Tszyu last night. And shout out to Tszyu as well, because he showed tenacity and he showed his willingness to fight despite the handicap factor that was displayed last night in this fight. And as I said, Sebastian Fundora, continuing on with what I was saying, he has this double-edged sword of a style of fighting where he throws at a relentless volume, and he throws more than the average super welterweight or more than the average fighter in all weight classes in boxing, but he tends to leave himself open to get countered, and he throws at an awkward position. And as I had said, he tends to throw with not that much meaning behind his shots, and he tends to throw just to throw. And when you throw as much as Sebastian Fundora does with the stature that he has, it causes stylistical troubles for his opponents that tends to be shorter than him and has a disadvantage when it comes to the reach. And Sebastian Fundora, he, as I said, throughout the entirety of the fight, after what had happened at the end of the second round, he was placing his punches very carefully, and he was able to throw more freely than from the beginning of the fight. Now, granted, the opening rounds be where fighters are trying to read each other, and that's why you can say that Sebastian Fundora was trying to get the data of his opponent and trying to figure out Tszyu and his game plan in the beginning rounds. That's why he tended to be slower, and Tszyu, being a fast starter, could have been overwhelming for Tszyu in the beginning rounds. And when there was that opening of a opportunity for Sebastian Fundora to fight the style that he is used to fighting in, he took full advantage of that. And that's what allows Sebastian Fundora to fight at a much more comfortable pace and fight at the distance where he wanted to fight at. And Tszyu, he still fought consistently, and he still fought the same game plan as he would have if he didn't have that cut on his forehead. Now, if he didn't have that cut on his forehead, as I had mentioned before, not making excuses for Tszyu, but if he didn't have that cut, most likely, arguably speaking, Tszyu would have had more success at executing that game plan more consistently throughout that fight if it wasn't for that blood trickling down to his entire face, and that messing with his game plan and his vision to place his punches more accurately and land accurately and be effective. And when landing his shots accurately, it causes more flush of a effective shot on his opponents, and that's why it affected Tszyu's fight throughout the entirety of the fight, from the second round all the way to the end. And as I've said, not making excuses for Tszyu, because Tszyu showed a valiant effort, and he still did a good job at mixing his punches, going to the body, placing his punches downstairs and upstairs, and he landed some effective shots as well by landing good, clean, heavy hooks and overhand right hands and left hooks that landed flush on Sebastian Fundora, that was backing up Sebastian Fundora whenever Tszyu would feel the pressure and show signs of desperateness. And Tszyu said, never mind this cut, and started to throw at will. And that's when Tszyu would gain success in the latter rounds. And as for the future for both fighters, now the super welterweight division seems to have excitement and a good scenery going on in their division. As now Errol Spence, after his first defeat that he suffered versus Terence Crawford last year, he is looking like he's going to have his next fight at super welterweight, making his debut at 154. And it's looking like Errol Spence, because what took place after the fight during the post-fight interview, he's lining himself up to have a shot at the newly unified WBC WBO Super Welterweight Champion Sebastian Fundora for Fundora's possible next fight. Now, is Errol Spence in his first fight at Super Welterweight, is it going to be for the unified, most recognizable Super Welterweight title? Now, to all the other Super Welterweights, it doesn't sound fair, but the recognition that Errol Spence holds with his name and reputation, because he is such a draw, he can have that fight versus Sebastian Fundora, and it would be considered to be one of the most lucrative, marketably speaking, and attraction-wise speaking, the best fight to make happen for PBC, and it'll be an easy fight for PBC to make happen because both Sebastian Fundora and Errol Spence are PBC promoted fighters. And Terence Crawford, who became undisputed welterweight champion after defeating Errol Spence last summer, he's also rumored to move up to super welterweight as well. Now, he's rumored to fight in the summer this year with a to-be-announced opponent. There's been a lot of rumored opponents for Terence Crawford to face next. And Terence Crawford tweeted after this fight that he is showing signs of interest in fighting Sebastian Fundora as well. Now, after he defeated Errol Spence, he showed signs of interest in fighting Jamel Charlo, who was the former undisputed super welterweight champion before he vacated his undisputed super welterweight titles for him to move up to super middleweight to challenge for the undisputed super middleweight titles versus Canelo last September. And now, after Jamel Charlo lost to Canelo, he's eventually gonna probably have his next fight back at super welterweight, and he's gonna be wanting to regain his super welterweight titles that he never lost. And I would say he still should be considered the best super welterweight fighter amongst the super welterweights, regardless of the fact that he's not a champion as of right now. I think he still holds the lineal Ring Magazine super welterweight titles, but as far as the alphabet titles, he doesn't hold none of them. And as I said, Jamel Charlo is still in the mix when it comes to the best super welterweights. And Terence Crawford has shown signs of wanting to fight Jamel Charlo, and he's obviously showing signs that he wants the titles at super welterweight. Now, I don't know if Terence Crawford still holds 3 of the 4 welterweight titles, because he had to vacate the IBF welterweight titles because he didn't fight Jaron Ennis, who was the interim IBF champion prior to him being crowned the legitimate IBF welterweight champion, because Terence Crawford and his camp didn't agree to announce Jaron Ennis as their immediate next opponent. Now, if Terence Crawford decides to move up to super welterweight, will he have to vacate all the rest of the welterweight titles that he won to become undisputed by defeating Errol Spence last summer? Most likely. But other than a fight versus Jaron Ennis, there isn't that much marketable fights available for Terence Crawford. If he's going to fight Keith Thurman, who was originally scheduled to fight Tszyu at super welterweight for Tszyu's WBO super welterweight title and the vacated WBC super welterweight title, and Keith Thurman doesn't have that much experience fighting at super welterweight. He made his reputation at welterweight. Now, for sure, Keith Thurman can fluctuate between welterweight and super welterweight, and Keith Thurman's last fight was at welterweight when he defeated Mario Barrios. Now, other than a fight versus Keith Thurman or a Jaron Ennis for the title that Terence Crawford never lost, I don't see any lucrative, marketable, sensible fights for Terence Crawford at welterweight. And speaking for the purity sake of the sport, there isn't any other good fights left for Terence Crawford at welterweight. Now, the fight versus Keith Thurman would just be for clout for Terence Crawford. It would be a good look for Terence Crawford to have a name like a Keith Thurman on his resume, to say he got a victory over on a name that is well recognizable like a Keith Thurman. Now, Jaron Ennis, that would be a heck of a challenge for Terence Crawford to hold his undisputed welterweight titles against. Other than that, I'm all for Terence Crawford to move up to super welterweight and to seek for Terence Crawford to conquer another title at another weight class. And he did tweet out saying to Errol Spence, "You lost." Speaking of Errol Spence, he got to work his way back up from the bottom and start from the back of the line and earn some wins for him to have a title shot at a weight class that he's never fought at before. And Terrence Crawford, because of the weight that he holds and him being the current unified, and I can say a well-deserved undisputed, he still should have the reputation of being the undisputed welterweight champion because he still hasn't moved up to super welterweight as of yet officially. And if he never lost his undisputed welterweight titles, now I'd like to see Terrence Crawford finish his work at welterweight. And I'm only considering the work. Terrence Crawford can do whatever he wants because he can move up to super welterweight, and he's done it all in lightweight to super lightweight to welterweight. And if he decides to move up to super welterweight, it would be Terrence Crawford trying to take on a new challenge, and I'm all for that. But as a fan, I would like to see him fight Jaron Ennis because that would be a good fight to make happen for the sport's sake. And both fighters are in their tip-top shape. And as far as Jaron Ennis, he's still a little green. He doesn't have as much experience as a Terrence Crawford or even a Errol Spence. And if Jaron Ennis keeps on collecting wins and keeps on improving, then he's already arguably up there in the midst of being a possible future pound-for-pound king. And then there's Virgil Ortiz Jr. as well. He doesn't have a title, and he hasn't fought as frequently and as consistently as Jaron Ennis. But with the knockout ratio that he has and the reputation he earned because of the style that Virgil Ortiz fights at, despite his health problems and his inconsistency, Virgil Ortiz is still considered to be a potential champion and a potential future pound-for-pound king as well. And other than those two guys, I would say Virgil Ortiz is more of a legitimate challenger to the welterweight titles versus Terrence Crawford and Jaron Ennis than a Keith Thurman. Other than those two prospects that still is on the come up, and if they were to fight a Terrence Crawford or even a Errol Spence, Terrence Crawford and Errol Spence would still be the favorite to defeat those guys. But if they get more experience versus more recognizable names and earn more mean wins, then they can legitimately be a more of a threat than they already are to a name like a Terrence Crawford and Errol Spence. And Errol Spence, who has already decided to move up to 154 at super welterweight, because from the looks of it, appearance-wise, during the post-fight interview after the fight with Tszyu and Fundora, it looked like Errol Spence put on a few pounds. And we don't know how Errol Spence will look competing at a new weight class at 154. And he's got to get himself in shape. And that's going to be decided depending on how his training camp goes whenever his next fight is announced. And Errol Spence, if he's more comfortable fitting in at making weight at 154 than compared to at 147, then we'll see how he performs if he decides to move up, which he most likely is looking like is going to move up to 154 for his next fight. And we don't know who he's going to take on in his debut fight at super welterweight for his next fight, because he hasn't even announced the next fight and when that's going to be. And as for Terrence Crawford, he's consistently in the gym, and he's still looking like he's in tip-top shape. And from what I've heard from multiple sources is that Terrence Crawford is training to fight at 154 and compete at super welterweight now instead of him sticking around at welterweight. And as I said, whatever Terence Crawford decides to do, that's solely up to him. And best of luck to him. And Terence Crawford, he has his own promotion. It was a one-time deal that Terence Crawford had with PBC to make that mega fight happen with Errol Spence for their undisputed welterweight title fight. And that's why it'll be an easier fight for PBC to make the fight happen with Spence and Fundora than a fight with Fundora and Crawford. Because Crawford is going to look for more funds to be kicked to him if he's going to work with PBC to have a fight with Sebastian Fundora or a Tszyu, who is also a fighter promoted working with PBC. And I would like to see another fight with Tszyu and Fundora because this was a compelling bout that we saw last night. It was fierce, it was competitive, and it was close, and it was gory, and it told a story of what boxing fans admire and like so much about the sport of boxing. It showed an element of what defined boxing for so long, and that was both fighters being determined despite the adversary that they were facing during this fight last night, and their gut and will and fortitude of never giving up and staying at it. And that's why I wouldn't mind seeing another fight with these two. And I'm sure in the future, this fight can most likely happen because both fighters are promoted with PBC. And will it happen immediately? I don't know. But from the looks of it, during the post-fight press conference, the manager of Sebastian Fundora did say it's their job to look out for the best interests of the fighter that they manage, being Sebastian Fundora. And the most money-making fight for Sebastian Fundora, despite the fact that this fight with Tszyu was close and competitive and it was a fan-friendly style affair, the fight with Errol Spence is more of a marketable opportunity for Sebastian Fundora, who is not as well known as a Errol Spence, and that could catapult Sebastian Fundora if he turns out to be successful versus Errol Spence, if they do make that fight happen for Sebastian Fundora's next fight. That can be a opportunity for Sebastian Fundora. It's a opportunity for Errol Spence as well, because it gives Errol Spence a chance to fight now who is arguably considered the best champion at super welterweight, and gives Errol Spence a chance at being a champion in another division. And he gets to do that versus Sebastian Fundora, who's been fighting at super welterweight and has been considered to be a consistent top super welterweight. And then now that he is a unified champion at super welterweight, as I have mentioned before, now he's considered to be arguably the best champion at super welterweight. And if it's a win-win double-edged sword situation, well, not double-edged sword, a catch-22, that's a better metaphor to use, because if both fighters, whoever comes out victorious in that fight, Errol Spence would be a good look for him for the reasons that I mentioned before. And as far as Sebastian Fundora, he'll get a win if he gets a win versus Errol Spence. If they do in fact fight sometime in the future, then Sebastian Fundora can say that he can not only have Errol Spence on his resume in the names that he's defeated, but now he's going to gain more recognition because he beat a reputable fighter that is well known like a Errol Spence. And as far as a rematch, Tszyu, he is a big draw out there in Australia. That's on the whole nother side of the world. And Tszyu, he is a generational talent. And Tszyu, being a crossover talent, being from Australia, he is a big name out there. And then he was looking to do the same out there in America and earn the same reputation that he holds in Australia. But he couldn't do that after last night when he got defeated by Sebastian Fundora. He still has the opportunity to earn himself a reputation, and this fight didn't hurt Tszyu's reputation at all because he showed a valiant effort and he put on a fight that not only just boxing fans are like to see, but sports fans and the public likes to see. And a style like that and a fight like that and a performance like that gains more fans than a unfriendly style of a win that fighters collect more times. And Tszyu, as I have said, if he decides to fight any other top super welterweight for his next fight, whether it be in Australia or America, is still going to draw Australia without a shadow of a doubt because he's got the local support out there. But in America as well, not only because of his name, but because what he's been able to do for himself as his own man. And the current scenery at the super welterweight division right now with Sebastian Fundora being the only unified champion at super welterweight. Now, Sebastian Fundora, as I said, for his next fight, there's a lot of opportunities for lucrative fights out there for Sebastian Fundora for his next fight. Of course, there's a fight versus Errol Spence that's available for him if he wants to make that his immediate next fight. Another fight versus Tszyu is still available for him. And if he wants to avenge his only defeat in his professional career versus Brian Mendoza, that's available for him as well. Brian Mendoza was featured on the undercard to this event as well, but he took a close decision loss versus Serhii Boachuk via unanimous decision. Now, Boachuk, after he earned himself that hard-fought victory, became the new WBC interim super welterweight champion, and now that positions Boachuk to be next in line to challenge for the new WBC super welterweight champion, that being Sebastian Fundora. And then the next best ranked contender, according to the WBC, is a undefeated super welterweight by the name of Charles Conwell, who's fought with PBC before as well. Now, both of those fights would be easy fights to make happen for the PBC banner. And he could fight either three of those guys, Mendoza, Boachuk, or Conwell, for his next fight to defend his newly won WBC, WBO super welterweight titles. And then there is going to be a IBF super welterweight title bout in June with Jack Culcay and Bakram Multazaliv, and that's for the vacant IBF super welterweight title. It's going to be competed in Germany, and it's in June. And if Bakram Multazaliv can come out successful versus Jack Colquet in that fight, then PBC can make happen another title unification bout for the IBF, WBC, WBO super welterweight titles, because Bakram Murtazaliyev, he's had fights where it was promoted by PBC, and that's why that fight can be easily made sometime in the future for PBC to make happen with Fundora and Bakram Murtazaliyev. If Murtazaliyev can defeat Colquet this summer in June for the IBF super welterweight title. Now, that fight doesn't sound as marketable as a fight versus Errol Spence or Jermell Charlo, or as far as Charles Conwell and Serhii Boachuk, but it would still be a good look for Sebastian Fundora to go for another title and have him hold 3 of the 4 major titles at super welterweight. And as far as Jermell Charlo goes, he's going to be in the mix amongst the best super welterweights as well whenever he decides to make his comeback to competing at super welterweight. And we don't know when that's going to be. And when Jermell Charlo gets back in the mix at super welterweight, then Jermell Charlo is automatically going to be regarded as one of the best super welterweights in the mix. And it doesn't matter who he goes in there against. And if he comes out victorious and puts on a heck of a performance, then that's when Jermell Charlo is going to be in strong contention to challenge for any of the world titles that he never lost at 154. And the current WBA super welterweight champion, a undefeated Uzbekistan fighter by the name of Israeli Madrimov, who was able to capture the WBA super welterweight title by defeating Magomed Kabrinov in an impressive 5th round TKO. And he's not that well known, but he is a champion that's undefeated, and he's technically sound as well. And he has got to be in the mix amongst the best of the top of the super welterweights, because he holds one of the major titles at super welterweight, and that was on the undercard to Anthony Joshua versus Francis Ngannou. And Israeli Madrimov, that fight was broadcasted on the Zone when he was able to capture that WBA super welterweight title. Now, PBC has majority of the top super welterweights. That's why for a title unification bout for Israeli Madrimov to get would be versus a fighter like Jack Colquet. If Jack Colquet can defeat Bakram Murtazaliyev in June, and if Bakram Murtazaliyev comes out on top and defeats Jack Colquet in their bout, Bakram Murtazaliyev, who's not as well known as a Tszyu or Sebastian Fundora, Jermell Charlo, Errol Spence, Terrence Crawford, then a fight versus Bakram Murtazaliyev can be possible, and it'll be an easier fight to make happen for a cross-promotional bout with the Zone and PBC and Matchroom. Now, I don't know if Israeli Madrimov works with Matchroom. Now, I don't know what his promotional deal is. If Israeli Madrimov wants to have a title unification bout for his WBA title versus any other champion at super welterweight. His best bet would be versus who's going to be crowned the IBF super welterweight champion with the bout with Jack K and Bakram Mortazalev. And Tszyu can fight the winner of that fight, or he could look to challenge for the WBA title versus Israeli Madrimov, because Madrimov, being a Eastern Europe-based fighter who's fought in Dubai and all over, that fight can happen in the Eastern Hemisphere. And as I said, Tszyu is arguably the biggest name that currently fights out of Australia, if not the biggest name that hails out of Australia. And that fight would be a huge draw in Australia. Doesn't matter who Tszyu decides to take on next. If he has his next fight being hosted in Australia, that's going to draw a crowd. And if it's for a title, it would have a more big fight feel of a huge magnitude. And that's why that fight versus Israeli Madrimov would be a fight that would be sensible and marketable and the most money-making opportune fight. And it would be a good look, the most opportune fight career-wise speaking for Tszyu, for him to be able to capture another title at super welterweight while he looks to avenge his only defeat that he suffered last night versus Sebastian Fundora. And I know he's going to look to capture not only another title, but the titles that, well, a title that he lost and another title that he could have captured last night if he were to come out on top. And Tszyu, like any other top super welterweights that I had mentioned before, he's still up there with the elite names amongst the best super welterweights, like a Jermell Charlo. As I said, whenever he decides to get back in the mix, he's going to be considered one of the best at 154. Errol Spence, we got to see how he performs if he decides to have his next fight be his debut at super welterweight, as well as Terence Crawford. The same case goes for him, and as well as Sebastian Fundora, and as well as for Israeli Madrimov and Jack K and Bakram Mortazalev, and now Serhii Charles Conwell, and can't forget about Brian Castano as well, a former super welterweight champion, and as well as Magomed Kurbanov, because one defeat doesn't hurt a professional fighter's record, especially if he fought at a top level. And doesn't matter how that fighter loses, because this is boxing. And that does it for this video, y'all. Subscribe, like, share, all that good stuff. Click the links in the description to show y'all support for this channel. Anything will be appreciated. And I'm out of here, y'all. Be good and peace.